To set the stage for such a lively discussion, the organizers for this conference have recruited Mr. Sunny Verghese. He's here as a keynote speaker, and in his capacity as CEO of Olam and chairman of IE Singapore, I don't know of any other person who's been more in the thick of the action in the commodities business than Sunny. He has agreed to speak on food price inflation. Is it cyclical or structural? I've had the pleasure to get to know Sunny a little bit in recent years, as he's also the chair for the Governing Council for the Human Capital Leadership Institute at SMU. It's a strategic partnership between the Economic Development Board, Ministry of Manpower, and SMU. He needs no introduction to most of you, especially from the trading community. And just very briefly, for those of you who may not know him, he started with the Unilever Group, Hindustan Lever, in India, and then came to the Kevalram Chandrai Group in 1986. 3 years later, he started Olam as a greenfield agricultural products export business for the group. Apart from his leadership at Olam and IE Singapore that I've mentioned, Mr. Verghese is also involved in many professional and trade bodies, as well as advisory committees for the government. He serves as one of the 3 Singaporean representatives appointed by the Ministry of Trade and Industry on the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. He is also a member of Rabobank Food and Agribusiness Asia Advisory Board, just to name a few. He was named the Outstanding Chief Executive for 2006 in the 2007 Singapore Business Awards, and he was named as Singapore's Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year in November 2008. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sunny Verghese.
Thank you, Professor Raj Srivastava, for a very generous introduction. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'll follow Professor Raj's second protocol as observed in the US, lest I miss out any notable dignitaries in my salutation. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here. Delighted for 2 reasons. One, at Olam, we have a lot of IIFT alumni, several of whom are occupying senior leadership roles in the company, and have added significant value and made a big difference to our growth in this sector, in the agricultural commodity business. So I'm delighted to be here at their invitation. We also have connections with SMU, both as Olam and also as IE, where we run a trading track in SMU, which we support. So I'm delighted for both these reasons to be here this evening. I think there are 4 key developmental challenges that we face this century. And a lot of that is going to be addressed here in the form of the subsequent panels that follow my talk. I think the first key development challenge that we have is food security. And I think currently it's on top of our mind based on the consequences of the worst ever drought in US history over the last 50 years that has fueled the prices for the cereal complex. And then we have, as a second major developmental challenge, energy security. And the third developmental challenge is water security. And the fourth is the impact of climate change. And most of us as policymakers, administration, policymakers, or even business leaders, we see these 4 problems as isolated problems on its own. But there are several interrelated linkages between these 4. And when I talk to you today about food security, you'll already start beginning to see the significant interrelated causes that link up all these 4 developmental issues together. I'll start with really trying to focus on the food security issue and the significance of that and the drivers to food price inflation. The first thing I think we need to realize is between 2008 and 2012, we have lived through 3 major food price crises. The first was in 2008, June, which was sandwiched between the Bear Stearns collapse in January of that year and the Lehman collapse in September of that year. Amidst all those pressures, one of the worst recessions that we have seen in our lifetime, food prices reached a lifetime high in the middle of that crisis in June of 2008. And policymakers looked at it, and I've seen some commentary from the G8 leaders that gathered in Hokkaido that year, when they were caught unawares by the sudden spurt in food price inflation and the riots that ensued in about 42 countries, causing several deaths. And the G8 estimated that more than 120 million people were pushed below the poverty line as a result of the crisis. But they said that the last food price crisis before the 2008 one was in 1974. So the conclusion at the end of it all was that this is a flash in the pan, it's a cyclical event, not a long-term structural secular trend. Lo and behold, in 2011, February, we had a second food price crisis. And in 2012, July, we had a third food price crisis. And even the most hardened skeptics who believed that the 2008 food price inflation issue was a cyclical issue are now beginning to sense that there is a more structural undertone to this food price inflation. And this has different kinds of consequences in different countries. In Europe and in the US, where food accounts for about 7 to 10% of the consumption expenditure, the consumption basket. In countries like India, it is 70%. In some parts of Africa, it's 80%. In China, it is 45%. So when you have a disproportionate share of your personal consumption expenditure going towards food, and you have massive food price inflation, and combined with that, you have high youth unemployment. You will all have heard that in the recent past, Spain has said that they have 50% youth unemployment. In South Africa, it is 40%. In Nigeria, it's 35%. So when you have this combination of food price inflation and a significant chunk of your consumption expenditure goes towards food, and you have massive food price inflation, that can create the conditions for significant unrest. Some of the origins of the unrest in the Middle East, starting from Egypt, was all spearheaded by youth, unemployed, educated youth, under these circumstances in terms of the backdrop of significant food price inflation. So what are the drivers to this food price inflation? And is it cyclical? Is it structural? Are these 3 episodes that have occurred with fairly rapid frequency, particularly given the background that the previous major food price crisis was way back in 1974, is it really cyclical or is it structural? And in order to understand that, I think we need to trace some of the key supply side and demand side drivers, which are long-term secular trends that is resulting in this consequence. So let us look at the demand side drivers. Firstly, we have a growing population. For those of you who missed it, in 2011, we reached 7 billion people on the planet. In 2030, we are going to be 8.4 billion. And in 2050, we are going to be about 9.2, 9.3 billion people. It took us all of humanity in 1800 to reach 1 billion. Then it took 130 years to double that from 1 to 2 billion in 1930. Then it took 30 years to get to the 3 billion in 1960. Then the 4th, the 5th billion was in 14-year intervals. The 6th and 7th billion was in 12-year intervals. Africa today, for example, is 1 billion people on the continent. The estimate is by 2030, Africa will have 1.5 billion people, and by 2050, out of the 9.3 billion people, Africa will be 2 billion people. Currently, it is 14% of the world population. It is going to be 22% of the world population by 2050. Nigeria today has a population of 158 million people. In 2030, it is expected to be 380 million people. And UNDP has projected population growth rates up to 2100. Nigeria will be 1 billion people. About 6 of the 20 most populous countries will be countries that we haven't heard of, all in Africa, which will So if you look at the 2.3 billion delta in world population growth, about 50% of that, 1 billion people incremental, is going to be on the African continent. So it's the world's fastest growing population. 75, 80 million people, therefore, being added to the world population each year. They all need to be fed. But that's not a new trend. We have coped with this in the past quite well. The second big issue is that we have had about trendline growth in world GDPs before this recession that we are now witnessing. And that means per capita incomes have also risen very fast. If you just look at the BRIC countries, India's per capita income, which is the lowest of the 4 BRIC countries, is about $3,800 per capita. Indian per capita growth is expected to be between 6 and 7%, which means in 10 years' time, India's per capita GDP will double, right? China is $8,800. Brazil is about $12,000, $11,700. And Russia is about $16,000. Africa, the whole continent, average per capita GDP is $3,500. It has grown at about 4.8% CAGR over the last 10 years. That $4,000 is a critical inflection point, because if you look at history and the investment development paths and the development paths of other countries, when they hit that $4,000 per level, per capita level, you see a ramp up in demand for food, raw materials, ramp up in demand for other resources. And that is why there's a race intensifying for resources. In Africa alone, Brazil, India, China are going head to head for controlling some of these scarce, non-renewable resources. There are about 450 companies that have come into Africa from China alone in the last 8 years. 150 companies from India that have gone there, all in search for resources. So there's a race intensifying for resources. So what has happened as a result of this rising income is that the per capita consumption of calories has gone up. So as a rough rule of thumb, low-income countries consume about 2,600 calories of food per capita. The middle-income countries, it's about 3,000. And the high-income countries like Singapore, we consume 3,600 calories of food per capita. So the difference between a low-income country food capita calorie consumption per capita versus the high-income countries, that difference is only 28%, between 2,600 and 3,600 calories per capita. But the difference in the value of that consumption is almost 770%, largely on account of the fact that as you get more wealthy, you have a significant shift in dietary habits from relying on feeding on carbohydrate and cereal-based diet to a dramatic shift towards protein and fats-based diet. So in the mid-'80s, China used to consume 15 kgs of meat per capita. Today, China consumes 50, 55 kgs of meat per capita. In the early 90s, we used to say that, it is cultural. The Chinese will never eat as much meat as the Westerners do. Europe and US consume between 100 and 110 kgs of meat per capita. Taiwan and Hong Kong, which are just larger parts of China, greater parts of China today consume about 95 to 100 kgs of meat per capita. So it's all about economics. If you can afford it, you will consume more protein and more dairy products and more fat, right? Just look at Africa today. 2.5 kgs of meat per capita consumption. And as Africa has already hit $3,500 per capita incomes and will go to $4,000 per capita incomes, there will be a rapid shift in demand for these raw materials. And to produce a kg of poultry meat, you need 2 kgs of feed grains. And to produce a kg of pork meat, you need about 4 kgs of feed grains. And to produce a kg of beef meat, you need about 7 to 8 kgs of feed grains. So there's a ramp up and an accelerator and a multiplier impact on the demand for feed raw materials as the dietary habits shift in this nature. The other big demand-side driver is this whole phenomenon of urbanization, and there's a revolution in urbanization across most developing economies. China, for the first time last year, in 2011, hit a 50% urbanization rate. So Chinese urban population now is 51%, and rural population is 49%. India this year is going to be hitting the 30% urbanization rate. Africa is 40%. Latin America is 78%. But cast your mind, 25 years ago, Latin American urbanization rate was in the 40% region. Now, what happens because of urbanization? The per capita consumption of food raw materials in urban population in China, for example, pork consumption in the urban population is 3.5, 4 times that of the rural population. Dairy consumption is about 3 times the rural population. And so too with poultry meat and beef and other product. So as you urbanize, and there's a revolution in urbanization, you're going to see, in Africa alone, there are about 52 cities today with 1 million population. China totally today has 68 cities with 1 million and above population. Africa's, just 10 years ago, there was 35 cities with 1 million population. And the estimate is by 2020, Africa will have 72 cities with population in excess of 1 million. So that's a big revolution, and that demand will therefore ramp up. And finally, as if all this was not enough, we shot ourselves in the foot by diverting more and more of the food and feed raw materials into fuel production. In the past, the demand for agricultural raw materials had the 3F as sources of demand: food, feed, and fiber. And now we have the 4th F, fuel. Almost 40% of the US corn crop has gone into ethanol manufacturing. 52% of the Brazilian sugarcane crop has gone into ethanol manufacturing. A full 10% of all world oilseed consumption has been diverted into biodiesel manufacturing. 447,000 hectares globally is now just meant for biofuel consumption. That is a significant shift. Now, from a demand standpoint, with all these trends that I mentioned, we need to increase food production by about 110% between now and 2050. But on the supply side, we have to do that with our hands tied behind our backs. It's like asking some of you to sing while you're chewing gum at the same time. So we're going to have our hands tied behind our backs if you look at all the supply side drivers. Firstly, there's reducing arable land. China alone, for example, if you look at its 12th five-year plan, has said that it needs 125 million hectares under cultivation to get to 95% food self-sufficiency. Currently, we believe there's about 121 million hectares under cultivation. That's not the government records or published data, but that is what we believe is actually there. And that land is being lost at about 0.5% CAGR per annum. In 2004, the government got very worried about this situation and said there will be no conversion anymore of agricultural land to commercial purposes or commercial uses. And since that grand announcement, and they had banned any golf courses from coming up in these agricultural land, 440 golf courses have come up since 2004, despite the government's intent not to allow that to happen. And that is because they just first convert their agricultural land to wasteland, and once it is wasteland, you can use it for any other kind of purpose. So all of this agricultural land, which is converted into golf courses, went through that clever path. So we believe that Chinese land under cultivation in 2015 will be about 116 million hectares. At 116 million hectares, China will become a massive net importer of grains. It'll import between 17 and 20 million tons of corn. It'll import between 7 to 10 million tons of wheat. It'll import 6-7 million tons of rice. And in addition to importing about 60 million tons of soybeans today, which by 2015 will grow to 86 million tons. China has roughly 90 million hectares under food crop cultivation, the 4 major food crops: wheat, corn, rice, soybeans. And that acreage has not moved for the last 15 years. If China has to become just self-sufficient in soybean cultivation, it has to put another 33 million hectares under cultivation, which is almost a third of its entire acreage under food crop cultivation. If you look at the satellite imagery of the 52 biggest cities in China, you will see that the urban crawl is growing at about 2.5% per annum. That is, as the urban cities grow larger, they're taking surrounding farmlands, and you're losing surrounding farmlands. You're also losing surrounding farmlands because of alkalization, salinization, desertification, soil erosion. Some of the natural agricultural causes are also resulting in less and less land being available. So first big issue is that we have to produce significantly more with less acreage available for cultivation. The second is that there's a significant decline in productivity growth rates. Between 1960 and 1990, agricultural productivity growth rate was 2.2%. Between 1990 and 2008, agricultural productivity growth rate declined by half. That is because till the late 90s, we had 3 or 4 decades of food price surpluses and real low prices of food. And therefore, researchers and public policymakers said, why do we want to compound that problem by investing more in public institutional research and increase the supply side? Because then farmers are going to get a lower and lower price, and we need to subsidize that. So they turned off the research. Most agricultural green revolution breakthroughs in India and most of the developing world came from public institutional research, not from private research. And if the governments want to turn that clock back now, it is not like switching on a button, because research is cumulative, it is path-dependent. You do trials, you find some results, you build on that, so it takes a long time to get to meaningful, productive breakthroughs. So it will take a long time to reverse that trend. The third big issue that we have is rising cost of energy. Energy accounts in the mechanized large-scale plantation sector, 47% of the total production cost is accounted for by energy costs, whether it is how you till your land using tractors and other mechanized means. It is the cost of transportation, it's the cost of fertilizers, which are all energy and raw material dependent. And even in smallholder farming systems, about 38% of the cost of production is energy related. And with rising energy prices, you have cost push inflation in terms of your cost of production. The other big, most serious issue is water constraints. So today, we consume about 4.5 trillion cubic meters of water globally. 71% of that is meant for agriculture or used in agriculture, and the balance in industrial use and household consumption. To feed a population of 8.3, 8.4 billion people in 2030, we need 6.9 trillion cubic meters of water, almost 50% more than the water that is known and available today. China has 20% of the world's population, 8% of its water. And therefore, Chinese have overexploited its underground aquifers, and the water levels in the north of China that produce about half its wheat, a third of its corn, is declining at roughly 3.5 meters per year. The water tables in the northwest part of India is declining at 6.5 meters per year. Yeah? And as you switch to a more protein and fats-based diet in terms of the dietary habits changing, you have more and more intensive requirement for water. So to produce a kg of wheat, you need about 1,500 kgs of water. To produce a kg of pork, you need 10,000 kgs of water. To produce a kg of beef, you need about 16,000 kgs of water. I had a business breakfast this morning, a healthy one. Typically, when you go for these business breakfasts, you indulge. So I had 2 slices of toast. It is 80 liters of water. I had 1 roasted tomato, 13 liters of water. I had 1 potato, equivalent of mash, that is 24 liters of water. I had 2 slices of bacon, 360 liters of water. I had a glass of milk with my cereal, 150 liters of water. I had a cup of coffee, 150 liters of water. I don't know who's doing the addition here, but that is 1,000 liters of water for one meal. A hamburger for me, to produce one hamburger, you'll need about 2,400 liters of water. This cotton shirt that I'm wearing is 8,000 liters of water. The pair of leather shoes that I have today is 16,000 liters of water. Right? And as we change our dietary habits and want to eat more protein and fat-based diets, we are going to drive up the demand for water. China in the early 90s, late 80s, used to allocate 90% of its fresh water for agricultural production. Today, it allocates 60%, 65% for agricultural production. The rest goes to industrial use and household consumption. Right? So we have a massive water problem. The other big supply-side driver is the impact of climate change. A lot of us who are skeptical about climate change kept saying, all this is bogus data. There is really no serious threat in terms of change in weather patterns globally. World temperatures have gone up roughly 0.8 degrees in the last 50 years, but it has created havoc in weather disruptions. We've had more frequent episodes of floods and droughts and prolonged episodes of floods and droughts. You open up the newspaper, any day it is a drought in US, or it's a flood in Australia, or it's a fire in Russia, or whatever. But there are more and more frequent episodes of that. And all of that is because of climate-related change in weather patterns. The UN IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its study has said that the Himalayan glaciers are likely to melt by 2035. That supports 6 major river systems: the Irrawaddy in Myanmar, the Indus in Pakistan, the Brahmaputra in Bangladesh, the Ganges in India, the Yellow River, the Yangtze rivers in China. All of this together support about 1.4 billion people directly dependent on these 6 river systems for their agriculture. Lake Bam in Burkina Faso in the last 30 years has almost dried up. And we have seen it in the last 20 years as we operate in that country. Lake Chad, which is a much bigger deal in terms of water mass, is rapidly drying up. And these are just some examples, but these are not selective examples that I'm pulling out. The fact is that we will have a major water crisis. Olam invested in a very large-scale almond plantation in Australia in 2009. 80% of the investment consideration that we paid for was for securing permanent high-security water rights. Right? So we know what it really means to find water. We need 12.5 megaliters of water for every acre that we farm. And this is with high water usage efficiencies. It is drip irrigation, all controlled centrally, and it will measure the dryness around the surface of the almond orchard tree, and it will release water exactly when it needs it, exactly the amount of water it needs. Even with such high water usage efficiency, we need that quantum of water to really get those yields and productivities. So water is the other big constraint. And then we have environmental constraints. In the past, it was easy to fell forest land and plant more food. Now, the Norwegian government 2 or 3 years ago gave the Indonesian government $1 billion saying, please don't do that anymore. Take money from us. Right? It's not going to be easy, unlike in the past, to go and fell forests and plant more food. So you got environmental constraints. You got logistics and infrastructure chokes. A lot of people tell me when I give this talk to other audiences, you can solve all this problem by just reducing food wastage, because a massive amount of food wastage occurs. And that is true. But how do you prevent and reduce that food wastage in the supply chain? You need massive infrastructure investment because there's a big deficit of agricultural infrastructure, whether it's silos, storage spaces, elevators, warehouses, cool chains, all of that stuff. The FAO committee of experts discussing the food security issue have estimated that you need $90 billion annually to support infrastructure investments to bridge this gap every year from now to 2050, which means $3.6 trillion of investment required in setting up agricultural infrastructure to support this. I see a lot of you have got frightened. You don't have to rush out and buy and hoard food. And the governments haven't helped because they have resorted to policy measures. Unfortunately, the governments are clueless about how to tackle this problem. And I remember it was so interesting that the Hokkaido, when the first food price crisis hit in June, the G8 ministers are meeting there, and they spend $500 million on that summit. That could have fed 100 million people for a month. Yeah, and amongst the choicest of caviars and Kobe beef and everything else, these people were so unrelated to what the hell is happening on the ground, started finding scapegoats who they could blame for this fiasco. Yeah, so the first blamed FAO that they slept on the wheel, didn't really do the job and didn't really tell us that this was a crisis. Then when that didn't wash, because FAO showed the reports that they were continuously providing them, they started blaming speculators and commodity merchants and traders, saying that a lot of this commodity price inflation has been fueled by the financial demand created by the speculative acts of traders. So under Sarkozy's presidentship, we were invited to present data to confirm his thesis and the G20's thesis that the rogues who are really directly responsible for food price inflation are these commodity traders with no conscience in the heart. And we deal in 44 agricultural commodities. So we presented data both for futures traded commodities, where there's a long historical price data series available on public domain, and also for the cash traded commodities where the information was proprietary. And we showed that the cash traded commodities where there were no futures market, therefore couldn't attract any speculative interest and speculative funds flow, the volatility and price rises were significantly higher than the futures traded commodities. We were not invited to any other meeting of the G20 after we provided that evidence. What have governments done? China has imposed price controls. So there is edible oil price controls today. There are price controls on various things. The Indian government knows if onion prices go up, they will fall. Right? So their first reaction is to, as soon as prices go up, to have food price controls. What does that mean? It means when you need an undistorted price signal to get a massive supply response from farmers, that price signal is distorted and cut off. There's no incentive to the farmer to produce more or produce better. So we have a serious issue and problem, and the idea of my talk today was to provoke you. I didn't want you to feel comfortable. I've been very deliberate in provoking you to wake up. This will be one of the biggest developmental challenges that we'll face this century. Thank you for your patience.